January 22nd, 1942. The wind howled relentlessly over the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The RMS Laconia, a stately British passenger ship, cut through the night storm, her great hull trembling beneath the weight of the fierce waves that rose and crashed against her. To the untrained eye, the storm was a familiar enemy, a natural force that men had battled for centuries at sea. But for the Laconia, the tempest was not the greatest threat. Below deck, in the cramped, dimly lit radio room, Charles Phillips sat at his post, his hands hovering over the keys of the ancient Marconi transmitter. His mind, however, was far from the radio equipment before him. Instead, it was fixed on the looming danger that hung just beyond the horizon, invisible, yet undeniable. Phillips knew that out there, in the darkness, the enemy was watching, waiting. For days, Laconia had sailed across the Atlantic, bound for a port in the Caribbean. To the passengers, it was a luxurious, even routine voyage, the kind they had made countless times before. But the world was at war, and war had a way of warping even the simplest of tasks. Phillips, though only in his early 30s, had already spent years working in radio communication for the British Merchant Navy. He had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. But this particular voyage was different. The Laconia was carrying valuable cargo, precious commodities the Allies desperately needed. It was a prime target for the German U-boat fleet prowling the waters. They were hunting, like sharks circling in murky waters, ready to strike. Phillips had felt it in the pit of his stomach the moment they had crossed into U-boat-infested waters. The dread that settled in his chest wasn't based on superstition. It was the cold, calculated fear of a man who understood the stakes. The Laconia was not just another civilian ship. It was a military target, and the radio operator knew that his job was far more critical than ever. He wasn't just there to keep up the usual chatter with port authorities. He was a lifeline. The Laconia's radio, at that very moment, was one of the only links to the outside world. But now, as the ship pitched violently through the waves, Phillips was more worried about something far more immediate. The storm had come from nowhere, no warning from the weather reports. As it battered the ship, the wind screeched against the walls of the radio room, and Phillips could hear the metal groan, as if the ship itself was protesting against the immense pressure of the ocean. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from a strange, foreboding sense of inevitability. Something wasn't right. Phillips tried to focus. His job was clear: keep the ship's radio open, communicate with the convoy, and send regular reports. But the orders had changed. Earlier that day, an order had come down the chain of command. No transmissions unless absolutely necessary. The U-boats could be listening. The directive made sense on the surface. It was a standard wartime precaution, after all. But as Phillips sat there in the near darkness, surrounded by the hum of the old Marconi machine, something inside him refused to accept it. The storm outside might have drowned the ship's vibrations, but Phillips knew that the storm inside, the one threatening to swallow the Laconia, was real. The storm was bad, but it wasn't the only threat. There was a darkness beneath the surface of the water, something far more terrifying. German U-boats had been prowling the Atlantic for months, picking off vulnerable merchant vessels. The Laconia wasn't equipped with the modern sonar systems that military ships had. She had no radar, no protection. She was simply too slow, too big, too exposed. A sitting duck, and Phillips knew it. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. The wind howled, and the ship pitched wildly beneath his feet. The radio's static swelled, and Phillips gritted his teeth, trying to maintain his focus. He could almost hear the enemy U-boats in his mind, their engines roaring beneath the waves, closing in like a predator on its prey. The Laconia's hull groaned again, louder this time, as though it, too, could sense the growing danger. Phillips stood up, pacing nervously around the room. He was alone, save for the crackle of the radio. He stared at the glowing dials, the faint red glow of the transmission indicator blinking back at him, waiting for a signal, an order, something to tell him what to do next. The official order was clear: keep quiet. He was to refrain from sending any unnecessary signals. lest he give away the ship's position. But as Phillips watched the storm rage outside, his gut told him otherwise. The feeling was primal, gnawing at the back of his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. He had been trained to react quickly, to make split-second decisions in times of crisis. And in this moment, he felt it, the creeping dread of a disaster that would unfold in the next few hours. If the ship were to be attacked, Phillips knew that every second counted. The Laconia's communications were its only hope. Every signal sent could potentially be the one that saves them all. He wasn't willing to let that chance slip away. But there was something more. Phillips had been a radio operator long enough to know how easy it was for a transmission to go unnoticed, especially when there was a risk of giving away your location. He wasn't just worried about the U-boats listening. He was worried about the orders from higher up. The Naval Command's caution could very well lead to death by inaction. Phillips knew this. He understood the risks, but something inside him rebelled against the inaction. His fingers hovered over the keys of the Marconi machine. He had been in situations like this before. He had sent distress signals under more ordinary circumstances, when ships were in distress or when communication was vital. This wasn't the same. This was life and death. He had to make a choice. Phillips leaned forward, his breath shallow, the pounding of his heart almost as loud as the wind outside. He hesitated. He could feel the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders like a heavy burden. To send out the signal would be an act of defiance. It would mean breaking the rules, defying the direct orders of those in command. But if he didn't, if he obeyed the silence, then it would be the end of the Laconia. It would be the end of everything. He gritted his teeth and made the decision. He pressed the key. The static burst to life in the room, a sharp crackle breaking the oppressive quiet. Phillips quickly typed out the distress signal, his fingers moving faster now, the sense of urgency pushing him forward. His mind raced as he tapped out the words, SOS, followed by the coordinates of the ship, the condition of the vessel, the fact that they were under attack by an unseen enemy. As he hit the send button, a deep sense of relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. He could feel the heavy silence pressing against the radio room, and a cold sweat began to form on his forehead. What had he just done? Had he just condemned them all? The message went out into the ether, but there was no immediate response. Phillips sat back in his chair, listening to the quiet hum of the radio. He didn't know if the message had been received, and that thought gnawed at him. He couldn't see the enemy. He couldn't hear them, but he knew they were out there. And now, with the transmission sent, he could only wait. The radio operator was not a man prone to fear, but in that moment, as the ship rocked violently, the ocean roaring in its fury, Phillips felt a deep, visceral sense of the enormity of what was at stake. His eyes flicked to the clock. The hours stretched out before him like an eternity. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would decide the fate of all those aboard the Laconia. Would anyone answer his call? January 23rd, 1942. The Laconia was no longer the grand passenger ship it had once been. Now, she was a broken carcass adrift in the cold, unforgiving Atlantic. The night had swallowed her whole, and the storm, though subsiding, had left its mark. Phillips could hear the groaning of the ship's hull, its steel ribs straining under the weight of the icy water that had breached her. The explosion that had ripped through the ship earlier still echoed in his ears, a deafening reminder of the chaos that had followed. Outside, the frigid winds whipped across the deck, mingling with the cries of panicked survivors. The world seemed to have tilted on its axis. Everything was wrong. Everything was twisted. The Laconia, once a symbol of hope for the men and women aboard, was now a sinking tomb, and its captain, officers, and crew were scrambling in vain to salvage anything from the wreckage. In the chaos, the steady presence of the radio room had become a strange sort of sanctuary. It was quiet, almost peaceful compared to the storm outside, but the weight of Phillips' decision hung heavy in the air. Despite the destruction around him, the radio operator's hands were steady as he worked. His mind raced with the same thoughts that had haunted him earlier. He had done it. He had sent out the distress signal. But would it be enough? Was there time? He could feel the weight of each passing second like a physical presence, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Every minute they waited for rescue was a minute closer to disaster, but Phillips didn't allow himself to indulge in the terror. Instead, he focused on the radio, his fingers flying across the keys as he repeated the distress message. It was the only thing he could do. The ship was sinking. There were no other options left. The lifeboats had already been launched, but only a fraction of the passengers and crew had managed to get into them. Many had been lost to the waves or the blast. Phillips couldn't afford to think about them now. All he could focus on was getting the message out, keeping the line open, hoping that somewhere, out in the vast ocean, someone would hear. But time was slipping away. The radio operator sat hunched over the transmitter, the cold, sharp air of the radio room stinging his skin as he desperately tried to make contact. His eyes darted between the dials, each one spinning wildly in its own direction, a cruel reminder of how small and insignificant their plight seemed in the grand expanse of the ocean. Phillips wiped the sweat from his brow, although he could feel the chill of the sea air tightening his chest. Then, a sudden burst of static. The radio crackled, and Phillips' heart leapt in his chest. For a fleeting moment, he thought he had heard a response, but as quickly as the sound had appeared, it vanished. His breath caught in his throat. It could have been a coincidence, a technical glitch. His fingers trembled for a moment, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wouldn't give up, not now. Phillips continued to send the distress signals, typing out every word with precision. But it was no use. There was nothing. Silence. The eerie, oppressive silence of the ocean seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Phillips felt the tension inside him growing with each passing second. He needed to hear something, anything. In the midst of this vast, merciless sea, the radio was their only hope. But the transmission was a weak one, barely audible, and Phillips wondered if it had even reached anyone. He had been told that the U-boats could intercept these signals, listen in on the broadcasts, but he hadn't been prepared for the crushing weight of that silence. Had the enemy heard? Or had the signal simply dissipated into the ether, unnoticed? The truth was that Phillips had no idea if anyone had received the message. He could only wait and hope. But hope was a strange thing in a moment like this. It could sustain you, but it could also break you. The longer he waited, the more he felt the crushing reality of what was happening. The Laconia was sinking. It was going down, and no one was coming to save them. Not yet, anyway. Phillips had learned, in the most brutal ways possible, that hope had its limits. The waiting was a torment. Each passing minute was a reminder of how fragile their chances of survival were. Then, the silence was broken. It wasn't the comforting hum of an incoming message, nor the voice of a fellow operator answering his call. It was a crackle, a shift in the airwaves, followed by the faintest whisper of a human voice. Phillips felt his heart leap in his chest, and his hands trembled as he adjusted the dials, trying to clear the static. The voice was weak, garbled, but it was there. "This is American. Operator. We hear you." The words were disjointed, fractured by static, but Phillips could barely contain his relief. Someone had heard. Someone was listening. He leaned into the receiver, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the break he had been waiting for, the lifeline he desperately needed. His fingers moved quickly over the keys, sending out the critical information. He could feel the urgency in his own hands now, as if the very act of typing could somehow stave off the inevitability of the ship's sinking. His message was short, blunt, and to the point. They were under attack, the ship was sinking, and they needed help. Immediately. For a brief moment, Phillips allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. His message was out there. Someone had responded. Someone who could help. But as the seconds dragged on, the tension in the air thickened once again. Would this American operator, whoever they were, be able to send help in time? Or was it already too late? Phillips repeated the message, over and over, hoping that the operator on the other end could hear it clearly. He knew that time was running out, that each second that passed brought them closer to the abyss. His mind raced as he thought about the hundreds of men, women, and children still stranded in the water, clinging to lifeboats or debris. The ship's distress had been heard, but would it be enough? Would it reach the right ears? But then, the radio crackled again, this time more urgently. The voice came through clearer this time, no longer fractured by static. Stay on the line. Help is coming. Philip's breath caught in his throat. He had done it. He had gotten through. Someone was on their way to save them. But as his mind processed the words, another horrifying thought struck him. The U-boats were still out there, lurking just beneath the surface. The enemy could still strike at any moment. What if the signal had alerted them to the location of the Laconia? What if the Germans were closing in, preparing to finish the job they had started? The terror of the unknown hung over him, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't afford to think about that now. He couldn't afford to entertain those thoughts. There was a flicker of hope, however small, and he had to hold on to it. He had to believe that help was coming, that the American ship, wherever it was, could reach them in time. Phillips shut his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. The wind howled louder now, the sound echoing through the radio room, but Phillips barely registered it. His mind was fixated on the transmission. It was his final lifeline, the last thread of hope in an ocean of uncertainty. He typed again, as quickly as his shaking hands would allow, his words of prayer. He could only hope, now, that his faith in that thin connection was not in vain. January 24th, 1942. The Laconia was gone, swallowed by the merciless waves of the Atlantic. It had happened so quickly, too quickly. What had once been a sturdy, proud vessel was now a collection of splintered wood and twisted metal, sinking into the deep, cold ocean. The survivors, scattered across the dark, storm-churned waters, clung to the fragile remnants of their former ship. For those fortunate enough to find a lifeboat, the night was a blur of fear and cold, of hands grasping for survival in the face of an indifferent universe. But through the chaos, there was one constant, the hope that had been sparked by the faint, crackling voice of the American operator who had responded to Philip's distress signal. Help was coming, or so they had been told. As Phillips floated in the cold water, clinging to a piece of debris, his mind raced with questions. Had the American ship been able to make it? Or was it already too late? Hours had passed since that fleeting moment of connection, and in the vast, unfeeling ocean, time seemed to stretch into eternity. He could still hear the voice in his mind, the words that had given him a shred of hope. Help is coming. But now, as he bobbed helplessly in the water, that hope was becoming more fragile with each passing minute. Phillips tried to stay awake, his teeth chattering from the cold, his body numb from the freezing temperature of the water. The storm had passed, but the ocean still raged, each wave a reminder of how powerless they all were in the face of nature's wrath. He had heard the orders, had followed them as best he could, had sent out the distress signal when it counted. But even now, in the aftermath, as he clung to the wreckage of the Laconia, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the distance, the silhouette of a ship appeared on the horizon. Phillips squinted through the darkness, his heart racing. Was it the American ship? Or was it another enemy vessel, closing in for the kill? His mind spun with possibilities, his pulse quickening with each passing second. The cold was unbearable, but the fear that gripped him now was worse.